Okay. All right. Well, just think of it as the cost of remote. You'll have to go back to the recording for the first minute. Sorry. Cost of remote attendance along with lack of pizza. In my setting, I have discrete data, right? So data is measured at these different time points. And I'm assuming that the data, it might not be quantities that are represented explicitly in our mathematical model, but it's quantities that can be computed from the variables in our mathematical model. And of course, the physical system has an actual set of parameters associated with it. Maybe it is the viscosity in the blood, or some some temperature in a chemical reaction or whatever. But we don't know what these values are typically when we write down our mathematical model. And so the idea of parameter estimation is to use this data as our information about the physical system and try to come up with the parameter values that best match what was present here to generate the data. Now, the reason I put these two examples, besides the interesting pictures, is in the first case, I'm thinking of some sort of physical system that essentially can be experimented on over and over, right, in a reproducible way. So you can gather more and more data until you can figure out what you're interested in. Whereas here, typically, biological systems, especially when you're dealing with patients or individual animals, once you've made a measurement, you've altered the system in a fundamental way. Even if you don't measure, right, the system's always changing in time. So, if I get 2 different colds in 2 different winters, those are going to be different, right? I can't just group the data together. And often, in some experiments, you actually have to sacrifice the subject to get the data, and then you're actually combining data from multiple individuals to get these time courses. So different scenarios can come up, and that's important to be aware of. All right. Traditionally, what we want to do to find these best parameters, we define a cost function that depends on the data, some comparison between the data and the comparable quantities computed from our model variables for whatever parameter value we should happen to pick. And then we can plot, we have a cost surface over parameter space, and the best parameter value will minimize this cost. And so that's the traditional goal here. Okay. And in this setting, we can refer to the forward problem of taking the model for a fixed set of parameters, integrating forward and getting a solution. Right, and then that's one way we could do this, and then we could compute the cost function from that. The inverse problem is taking the data and the model and going back to find the parameters, or maybe being even more ambitious and trying to determine the model itself from the data. So maybe you have a class of models or something that you're comparing, and their ability to fit the data. Okay, so today's topic is all about these inverse problems. All right, so there's many issues with this trying to achieve this traditional goal. Okay, sometimes it works great, and there's many productive research directions that have made use of this type of thing. However, sometimes the cost function may be difficult to define, or even if you can define it, you may get a much less pleasant result. Right, so here's an example of a cost, what we call an energy landscape that came up in a problem, right? And you can see it's very different from the one on the previous slide. So who's to say that, this minimum is really better than this minimum, right? They're so close. How are you even going to find all of these distinct minima? What's to say you should just focus on one and ignore these others? Right. And how robust is this after all, right? Like, so if you just focus on the the global minimum, you change your data just a little bit. Maybe you made a small mistake in your measurements, then maybe suddenly this would be the global minimum. Right. So I've sort of written these types of things out in words. But the bottom line is, once we're away from this idealized cost function scenario, there's a lot of problems with just trying to find the one best parameter set and sticking with that. Again, even finding it can be tough, and even if you can find it, it might not be the right thing to do. One step moving away from this quantitative attempt to find any parameter set is the Bayesian approach. Okay, so rather than finding this one best parameter set, we want to estimate a probability distribution over parameter space. Right? So that will give us some idea of how likely any parameter vector is at being the relevant one to fit the data. Okay, so in sort of quasi-mathematical notation, what we're trying to come up with is for our given data, right, the probability distribution over parameters. Right? It's a conditional probability, and the Bayesian, Bayes' rule says this is how we should compute it. And so on the right-hand side, we have to compute this posterior that we're interested in, we have a prior distribution. So we need some sort of starting point in terms of how likely the various parameter values are in our minds in the absence of any data to go on. For example, if we knew we were modeling, animals, we might have a sense of their size range and know, okay, outside of this range, the probability should be 0. It's a simple example. Then this other piece, sometimes called the likelihood, is this conditional probability, where now instead of fixing the data and trying to estimate the probabilities of parameter values, which is really what we're interested in, here we get to fix the parameters and ask how likely is the observed data if these were the correct parameters, right? And so in theory, we could just compute this with our model, right? Just plug in the parameter values, compute the output from the model, and not use that as our probability. Okay, but really, we should take into account here that there may be noise in the measurement process. So we have to think of this not as just a delta distribution. Right? So even for a fixed parameter value, even though our model, if it's a deterministic model, will just give us one output and therefore a delta distribution, usually we think in terms of some broader distribution. So this is not just the delta. That's why I put model star here. Okay, and here's just a picture that I like from a recent paper using sort of a machine learning approach to try to speed up the computational cost of doing this type of thing. So they chose some sort of normal distribution, prior distribution on the parameter space. They actually trained a neural network, an artificial neural network, to generate a data distribution over each set of parameters, so this thing, and then they combine those two to come up with a posterior for observed data. Okay. All right, so I'll give you one example of this in practice, and then I want to tell you one important take-home about this, and then I'm going to switch gears. Okay, so in this example, what we did was we built a very simple sort of circulatory system model. Okay, so this is the style of model where your blood vessels are basically tubes. You have volumes, you have pressures, and things kind of act in this very physical, this sort of pump, as a physical pumping system, what I want to say. So, arterial volume, venous volume, heart has a systolic phase and a diastolic phase, and so on. Okay, so when we put this all together, there were 5 ODEs and 19 parameters. Okay, so ideally we would have some data from some patients, and we would try to come up with a probability distribution on this 19-dimensional parameter space to try to figure out what's going on with that individual patient, that data from which we collected the data. For this proof of principle, I want to be able to visualize things very easily, so we're just going to freeze 17 parameters and just play with 2 of them. So I hope you can forgive me for that. The 2 parameters that I'm keeping free here are what amounts to the contractility of all of these tubes in our circulatory model, and overall volume that's available. Okay, so those are parameters, and those are kept free. And in this example, I'm going to start from what we thought of at the time as a relatively uninformative prior. So we tried this, and it worked similarly with either a normal or uniform prior distribution. Okay, so here's a normal example. This is our prior, and this is centered at the pressure or contractility and volume values that we know are reasonable for a human. All right, so then for this experiment, a thought experiment, let's suppose that we're a clinician and we go in and we take a blood pressure measurement on this patient. And so now we have a piece of data. So we want to put that through our Bayesian rule and come up with a posterior distribution, which will be some sort of transformed version of this, where we've mapped the probability mass to the places that are more likely, that are consistent with the data observation from the patient. Okay, so here's an example of that. So low blood pressure or low arterial pressure is measured, and the probability mass very strongly shifts into what looks like this much more one-dimensional distribution. Okay, but there's actually two probability peaks. Okay, so the color coding here is probability, and there's two peaks. So if we were going for the maximum likelihood approach, we'd say, okay, this patient has hypovolemia, right? Their contractility is normal, but their vascular volume is low. But we're going to stick with the full distribution, and we recognize that there is a second local minimum over here, which has a much lower contractility and a normal volume. And so these would correspond to two completely different diagnoses for this patient that could have led to the low blood pressure reading. Okay, so the Bayesian approach tells us, okay, great, we've gotten a lot of information from one piece of data. Now let's collect another piece of data and turn the crank again. Okay, so this is actually what clinicians do. They're just not typically using, MCMC, Monte Carlo sort of simulation approach, but just their own experience, right? So they know there's a couple of causes that could result in this effect, and they actually will run an experiment on patients to try to distinguish the two. And so an experiment we can do here is to inject fluid into the patient. Okay, and the fluid, if you inject more fluid into a system, you kind of expect, okay, that should push the volume, the pressure up, right? Because you're not changing the volume. So let's see what happens if we inject fluid. What blood pressure measurement do we get now? Okay, so that's what it says here. So let's apply the Bayesian approach, assuming two different possible outcomes of this experiment. So we're going to have now the fluid injection. We're going to read blood pressure again, and let's check. Let's make some assumptions. Let's look at some scenarios of possible values that we could get. Okay, so in one case, the blood pressure has now gone up significantly due to this fluid injection. Okay, and when we put that through the Bayesian crank, we end up eliminating one of our probability peaks. And now we're down to this unique probability peak, which is at the low volume level. We haven't figured out what the contractility is, but it doesn't matter. We know this patient has an issue with hypovolemia, and that's what we should treat. Okay, whereas if this fluid injection still doesn't increase the blood pressure, at least not appreciably, then actually that moves all the probability mass down to this very low contractility state. And now we know, in fact, there's a heart failure event happening. That's why the blood pressure is staying low, and we need to do a different intervention for this patient. Okay, so that's how this is supposed to work, and this is an example of it working very nicely. So Zoom is embarrassed for me. It's trying to cover up this fact. Okay. So now what we realized later on is we did something non-optimal in that demonstration, and yeah, we got away with it. In this example, it didn't matter. Okay, but let me explain to you what we should have done differently. Okay, so pulling back out to the general inverse problem setting that I introduced, okay, we have some discrete data points. In this case, we just had 2 of them. And we have a model. And as I mentioned, we think of there being some sort of error density associated with the data. I'm going to call that gamma. Okay, so our posterior distribution, which is the Bayes formula without worrying about the denominator. What we're going to use here is what I tried to describe in words earlier. Okay, so our model for any given parameter vector will map forward into some values. And then, we use gamma to represent the likelihood of the actual data relative to what our model said we would get for that parameter. So the most likely is that we made no error, let's say, which we should have maybe a peak of gamma at 0. But we have to assume that we have some spread based on our knowledge of the errors that are likely to show up in the measurement. And that's what we put here. Okay. And then the question is, what should we actually use as the prior? So I said non-informative, right? Non-informative is good. Going in, we shouldn't assume anything. And therefore, we should maybe just assume, just take a uniform distribution on parameters. They're all equally likely or some sort of normal. And so these are 2 of the cases that people almost always use in the literature. A third is actually what's called the reciprocal prior, or sometimes Jeffrey's prior, where you're basically assuming nothing about the mean over the relevant parameter values in some sense. Okay. So larger values get downweighted, basically. All right. So it turns out none of these is the right choice to use. And I'm going to give you a cartoon explanation of why, and then just a quick calculation. All right, so typically our models are nonlinear. Okay, if it's linear, it's not such a big deal, and the whole problem is easier. But still not quite as easy as you would think, and that's what I'll come to at the beginning of the second part of my talk. Okay, but typically we have a nonlinear model. Okay, so that says some, changes in parameters won't matter very much for the output of our model, but maybe for other ones, other places in the parameter space we're much more sensitive. So suppose we take this uninformative distribution, prior distribution on the parameters. Well, what we are doing is we're saying that for this range of parameters, our model is going to give us a similar output, but for this range, it's going to give us very different outputs. So when we put this whole distribution through the model, we get something that looks like this. Right? There's a lot of parameter space that maps into these similar values. So we're in fact assuming that these observations are most likely. So by making no assumption on our parameter space, we are making an a priori assumption on what the data is going to be without having actually measured any data. So we are getting ahead of ourselves in that sense. Okay. Yeah.
Isn't it that is it possible that the fact that the nonlinear model barely changes in the range of parameter, does that mean that this behavior is more likely, or you don't want to assume?
I don't want to assume that, because for all I know, that's the wrong part of parameter space to be considering.
Prior be like what you know about the patient before you saw them. Like I go to the doctor, right? And like they 30-year-old male, like we know that distribution over the whole population. Isn't that like what the prior should be?
Yeah, so in some settings, you might want to take into account that you already do know some information about the subject, like from which you're getting the data. So then you should take that into account. My question is, what does it mean to be uninformative, right? Like what should you be doing when you don't know anything to begin with.
But you always do know something, right? Like prior is supposed to be something like
Yeah, so for example, you're probably going to constrain, as I said, your range of parameter space. Like your parameter domain should be bound.
yeah.
I'm not going to argue against that. Okay. Right. So if you have a large statistical, a large database from a population that you think is relevant, then you're not actually starting from the uninformative case. Okay. What Bayes discussed when he actually just talked about the non-informative prior, way back at the start of this approach, is that going into a situation, it's actually the data that is all equally likely, again, within some constrained range. Okay, so in that situation, when we take that backwards through the nonlinear model, it's the Jacobian prior that we should use on the parameter state. Okay, so in other words, our prior distribution should be proportional to the Jacobian computed on our model, whatever f is here, and that's what we should start with to avoid making any assumptions about relative likelihood of data value. Yeah, question?
But I think is you have to make an assumption about what kind of model you're using.
Oh yeah, right. So I'm in the scenario where we've chosen our f.
Yeah, in those cases.
Just to come back to this question, 30-year-old man, what kind of pressure you have. So what you're doing is essentially looking at which parameter will give you the right distribution of blood pressure across 30-year-old man.
That's right. So if you were in that situation, you could still apply this philosophy, right? You could say, okay, I don't want to start with this. I want to start with a different distribution. But then you should go back through the model and use that to map your distribution on parameter space the same way. So the take-home message is still relevant for you, even when you've assumed something non-uniform over there.
Yeah, I guess that's always like the Bayesian approach is like in terms of like updating. Right, it's like someone
like I showed in that example.
Yeah, so you put like a perturbation.
So you update.
Yeah, you put like a perturbation. Right. And even if you don't do perturbation, you just do a measurement.
Sure, you
like
get
someone comes in like the office, they're like, okay, this is like your age and sex or whatever. Like, here's my prior as to what your blood pressure should be.
Yes.
Right.
And that's a prior on the data space. At least in that model setting, the blood pressure was a readout of the model, not a parameter.
I guess I'm saying like why should that prior on the data space be a line and not what it actually
Yeah. So I'm saying the definition of non-informative should be uniform here. And if you have some other knowledge, some other starting point, you can still put it here. And then map back through the model to figure out what you should start with on parameter space where Bayesian calculation is. Yeah, so sorry, the data. Exactly. So this is maybe not in the best place. So yeah, so this is meant to be the distribution over data space. Y is the data. So thank you. I mean, I should really fix this and put Y here and Q of Y here. I'm sorry, people online, you couldn't see where that's a homework problem, figuring out where the Q should go and what should go on the vertical axis instead. All right, so yeah, I mean, here's the calculation. It's very simple, and my goal here is to figure out, what pi should we use to make sure that Q takes the same value regardless of what argument Y we plug in. And regardless of what data point we choose, we should get the same probability of that data being observed. And this shows you why the change of variables formula is relevant up, up to normalization. Why, if we plug in J for our prior, we get the desired result. And simply this fact that this is exactly what we need for change of variables, given that the F of P shows up inside gamma and this way. Okay.
It's a mathematical question.
Yep.
Is that always possible to, I mean, you have
To compute. Is it always possible to compute the Jacobian? Is that what you're
No, I mean, yeah, you can do that. Is it always possible to invert your model so that you obtain the distribution you want
No.
on the data?
Yeah. If you start with something non-informative, like non-informative shape on that Q of Y, then it's possible that you can't go back to a parameter distribution that will, through your model, generate that posterior. That's yeah, then you know your model's bad. Or you made the wrong assumption about the data. Okay, right. So yeah, so we found a reference where Stiegler points this out in 82, but it really hasn't been exploited or worked out in any mathematical representation for the most part. It's right. So one other quick demo now. I showed you that we got away with using the normal prior in our medical example. And here's a quick example with just a very simple 3D sort of, I don't know, think of it as a flu model, but it's basically just you have a viral load, you have a sort of healthy tissue that's going away, healthy population that's going away, and an infected fraction that's sort of rising and then decaying as well. So all we have is measurements of V, and they're shown here in a log space, and this is a fit. We get V values based on some classical approaches, maximum likelihood approaches to getting the best parameter fit from this model, including the initial condition for V itself, V0, which we don't already know. Okay, so then we did this little experiment where we tried different prior distributions. Okay, and you can see these are marginals, right? So if we freeze one of the parameters, four of the parameters, integrate over four of the parameters, and then just look at the distribution over the remaining one, we get very different plots in our posterior, depending which prior we pick. So again, the logic here is we pick a prior, we perform the Bayesian calculation to get a posterior, and then we plot marginals of the posterior on each of the possible parameters. And we see much more multimodality. And we start from the Jacobian, complete change in V0 compared to uniform, and so on. Okay. And then we go back and we sample from these distributions, parameter distributions, and generate model trajectories using the sampled parameters.
But did you know that the physical, if you just did the uniform without tracking too much, would you have known that something was funky?
Yeah, so let me show you, right? So if we sample whatever posterior you get, you're going to sample it and come up with your sort of envelope, your ensemble of trajectories for your model. So this is what you get. Right, so just in terms of actually fitting the observed data, plotted either in log space or not, you can see that the results from the Jacobian case are doing the best job at fitting the known data. So maybe you could just stop right there and say, okay, yeah, Jacobian's the best. Out of curiosity, if we plot the corresponding trajectories with respect to the other two variables, and compare them to what the parameters in black here gave. You can also see that the Jacobian is giving us the tightest fit on each, and even on I, whether that's a broader fit than each. So these are all good signs that the Jacobian is outperforming the other two for this example. we looked at a bunch of cases, nonlinear cases, and it never does worse. Okay, sometimes it does very comparable to one of these two. But in terms of performance, it's a safe bet. In terms of computational cost, there is an expense compared to just going with uniform and not worrying about it. So we would like to understand even better, like when does this outperform these versus performing similarly? And that's an open question. I'll look into that more thoroughly. Okay, so that's the first part. Any other questions people want to ask on that right now? Okay, so I'm going to switch gears for the second part. And is my target roughly what, like 20 minutes more? 15, 20, I don't know. 25. Okay, great. Let's say about this. Okay. So switching gears. Okay. So I'm gonna assume that we're in a scenario where we have, again, just discrete data points, and they're collected from one experiment that's evolving over time. Okay, so let's say in this case we have 3 data points. We make a measurement of X and Y, and this is the first values that we get at time 0, time 1, whatever you want to call it. At the next time point, we get these measurements. Okay, and now at a third time point, I want to consider 4 different possible measurements. Okay, so maybe we observe A, maybe we observe B, or C or D. And so the question we want to ask is, if we observe, say, A, B, C, or D, where does the trajectory go after that? And what type of fixed point, because this is from a linear system, 2D linear system, what kind of fixed point do we have at the origin? Okay. So, any thoughts? Which ones give us stable fixed points? Which one, does anything give us a node, saddle, focus?
C and D are stable. A and D are unstable.
And what type of instability? And what type of stable fixed point?
C and D have to be focuses if they are stable.
Any other thoughts? D is a saddle?
Yeah, you could have a saddle.
I mean, this is the qualitative inverse problem. We're trying not necessarily to figure out what exact coefficients did we use in the matrix A, but we still want to figure out some properties of x dot equals ax for the correct A that are consistent with this data. Okay, this is the simplest possible scenario, just 2D linear. And it's already an interesting problem. Okay, so here's what we see with A. All right, so we see that in fact it's a saddle. This is the past history of the trajectory that's consistent with these 3 data points. By the way, these are assumed to be equally spaced in time. That gives us the uniqueness. And that's the future. Okay, and here are the others. Okay, so C and D in particular, correct, give us a stable fixed point instead of an unstable one. D is actually a node, and C is a focus. Okay. So let's actually go to a harder version of this problem. So we're going to move away from 2D, but stay linear, since linear systems are easy. Okay, so here's some data. Okay, this is like an 8-dimensional linear system. So we have measurements of all of the variables, all of the x components in the system. We have a bunch of data points. Okay, and the question is, what will this trajectory do from here? What is the solution? Okay, so one possibility is everything just collapses to 0 because this is a linear system. What do you think? Is that what it's going to do? I'll give you some choices. Which of these is correct? Here's A. Here's B. Here's C. And D is that actually there's no linear system that fits all of it.
How many time points can it be?
It's basically the same number as components. We generally do that because we're trying to just make things as nice for ourselves as possible.
Say there are always in universe.
Okay. I mean, it looks like it because I showed you those other plots where it looked like it was going through the data.
But these different colors are different.
They're different components, right? X is like 8-dimensional.
Oh, I see.
It's a different component to that. All right, so I don't want to spend all my time. People don't seem to have strong guesses. And actually, it's a trick question because these are all generated by linear systems. Okay, what we did was we varied the positions of these star data points just a tiny, tiny bit. And so for this position, this is the unique solution. And then we vary it this imperceptible amount. And now this is the unique solution to a linear system. This is the unique linear system that goes through this data. Actually has a saddle, blows up shortly thereafter, and so on. And then for this linear system that goes through, for these positions of the asterisks, there is no 8-dimensional linear system that produces trajectories that go through these points. And so, yeah, we changed these by these positions by less than 2% between the 4 different plots. Okay, so this is actually a difficult problem, but we think it's a useful one to consider. Okay, because one, it's mathematically interesting. It's a highly nonlinear problem, even though it's a linear system to begin with. The inverse problem for a linear system is highly nonlinear. And it's still valuable. It might not be realistic to actually find parameter values for a model that fit the data, but it can still be valuable to get this type of qualitative information, right? We don't know of very much work in this direction. We've published a few papers and hope others will start to consider these problems as well. But yeah, the types of things we're after are, is our model correct, right? Can we even fit the data? If so, is there a unique parameter set that works? Even if we can't find P, can we say something about the solution? Is it periodic? Is it bounded? Is it unbounded or whatever? And how robust are these conclusions to errors in the data? All right, so we've been able to say a fair amount for linear systems because you can do so much with them. And so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but a lot of this was work between David Swegan and myself. David Swegan's a math bio colleague in the math department with me at Pitt, and our former student Shelby Stanhope, who was at Pitt at the same time as Yangyang, and is now tenured faculty member at the Air Force Academy out in Colorado. We always start from the setting where we have equally spaced data, and we're not specifying, we have equally spaced data points, so equally spaced in time. We're going to use this notation, xk, and we assume that this is a linearly independent set. Otherwise, we lose sort of the identifiability. We've proved various results about what happens in this status. Okay, now since this is a linear system, we have an explicit solution to the initial value problem. And I'm going to use phi as the notation for the principal matrix solution. Okay, and so the principal matrix solution acts to map us forward. If we evaluate it as one time step, it maps us forward from one data point to the next. And therefore, we can actually compute phi directly from the data. Okay, by basically forming matrices whose columns are various data points, and then just doing this calculation, we isolate this action. Okay, so phi has to do this. That's the operator that takes xk to xk plus 1. Okay, but we also know that phi has to do this. and because it's a solution to the linear system, which looks like this. And it's the one where we take B equals identity. And now we have two expressions, one that we know, and one that includes the A that we would like to find. And so we should be able to equate them and solve for A. And so you can see that in this case, everything sort of comes down to the matrix log. But the matrix log is much more complicated than just the log of a real or even complex number. Okay. So there are a lot of results about matrix logs that appear in the work of Culver from some decades ago. And actually the existence and uniqueness of solutions to equations of the type we care about depends on the Jordan structure of phi. Okay, and so depending on the Jordan structure, we may or may not be able to solve this problem, and we may or may not have a unique solution. And there's various ways that non-uniqueness can come up in the solution. So various scenarios where you get the same e to the A for whole families of A matrices. So for example, the second one ends up giving us a situation like this when we go back to the data. So we can have this collection of data points with this countable collection of linear systems whose solutions go through them due to the equivalence of the e to the A matrices from these different systems A. All right, so we can do this problem. And with 2D systems, we can do lots of visualization that's associated with it. So I don't know, maybe I should just show this. Okay, so yeah, the theorem, we can write down a theorem like this based on the matrix log, basically mapping the expressions or the conditions from the Culver theorems into conditions on the spectrum and structure of phi, corresponding to the different possible cases of solving this equation. All right, and then we can take these conditions, we can go farther and actually make some corollaries about when there is such an A, what is the fixed point? Is it a stable node or an unstable node? You know, these various cases we talked about based on the relationship between the eigenvalues of A and the structure of phi. Okay, and that looks like this in the 2D case. Okay, so if we let D and T be the determinant and trace of phi, okay, then depending on the eigen structure of phi, we'll sit at different places in this plane and we'll have corresponding information about a linear system that fits the data that generated phi in the first place. Maybe there's no such system, or a system must have a stable spiral, or so on. And then we can go back to that first experiment that I showed you where we have 2 data points and we ask where's the third one, and we can map that picture into this one. So depending where that third data point sits, we'll get a corresponding phi, and we can figure out where we are in the phi diagram, and then come back to this diagram and say, okay, this stable spiral region maps to down here, and so on. Okay, so this type of diagram is extremely useful when we go to start moving from linear systems even to nonlinear systems. This is the way we really like to think about this problem. We have n-1 of our data points. Let's think about, depending on where the final data point is located, let's visualize what information we can say about the solution of our system that goes through that data.
The delta t between the time points,
Yeah.
it's in phi. It's
Yeah. So
yeah.
So we're always like phi is like e to the A delta t.
Delta t, yeah. So if delta t is larger, you can make
the diagram
changes.
Okay, right. I mentioned we're interested also in robustness. So if we look at this diagram, for example, if this was our x0 and this was our x1, if x2 is here, our claim is that there's no linear system that produces a trajectory, no 2D linear system that produces a trajectory that goes from here to here to here in equal time steps. Okay, well, what if x2 was here, right next door? Would the conclusion be the same? You know, or what if we jiggle these data points? How much can we jiggle x2 in particular without changing that conclusion? Okay, so with a linear case, one of the nice things you can do is actually compute upper and lower bounds on a neighborhood size that allow you to keep your conclusions. So the lower bound basically says, okay, as long as the data is in this region, I know my conclusion still holds. The upper bound says if the data gets beyond this upper bound, I'm guaranteed that my conclusion fails. I'm guaranteed that there's a linear system with a different outcome that goes through x2 over here. And so, yeah, our papers include calculations of these bounds. And in the final few minutes, we did the same thing for affine systems, but I want to move to nonlinear. Okay, so we've recently written a couple of papers where we explore very in depth the nonlinear case, specifically in the Lotka-Volterra system. We took that as our starting point for a couple of reasons. Okay, one is it's what's called linear in parameters. So you think of the parameters as your arguments. Right? These are all linear terms with respect to those. It's also a very widely used system. And it's also quite interesting because without figuring out the actual parameter values, just figuring out their signs tells you something really important. Like, is this a predator-prey system, or is it cooperative or competitive, right? So it's a good situation. It's a good system where qualitative information can be helpful. It also has this nice property and this nice property. So it does have an integral. In particular, we focus on the 2D case where it's already interestingly complicated. And our hope is, you know, by working out this situation very thoroughly, we can start to recognize some general principles that we can apply to other linear and parameter systems and maybe even more general linear systems. Okay, so in this system, this is the conserved quantity, doesn't change over time. And one of the qualitative things we're after, as I mentioned, is what we call the sign signature, the signs of these four parameters. Okay, and we're going to assume that we have these two data points, and we're going to ask, you know, what happens, how does the qualitative information about the system depend on the location of each two or equally time-space data point? Okay. And so our papers, as I mentioned, we have 2 papers this year on this, talk about these issues. If that was enough time to scan that. And as I was hinting, you know, we can kind of think of there being this manifold, this 6-dimensional manifold of unknowns or things that we want to vary. Right? There's the 4 parameters whose values we don't know, and there's the 2 coordinates of the final data point that we want to think of as free. Okay, but just as I was mentioning, for the linear case, we spent a lot of focus on this view in terms of the possible coordinates of the final data point, which we call the P2 diagram. And so the final result that I'll wanted to make sure to get to is this one. Okay, so this is what the P2 diagram looks like for Lotka-Volterra, 2D Lotka-Volterra. So we've assumed for generating this diagram, because you have to do something concrete for numerics, right? So this is our first data point, that origins down here. This is our second data point. There's not some time step here. And then this shows us, we step forward the same amount of time from P1. These are the possible locations of the final data point. And the color coding tells us the sign signatures. If the red has one sign signature, green has another, magenta has another. The B's are places where the solution is unbounded. Okay, everywhere else it's bounded, except in the white regions, there's no Lotka-Volterra system that goes to the data. And in the dashed region especially, but here as well, you see there's this band here and here. There's non-uniqueness. So this whole manifold, right, it's a projection of a 6D manifold down into 2D space. This whole manifold folds over on itself. And you get these regions where there's different forms of non-uniqueness. Same signature or different signature, pairs of parameter sets that work. Yeah. So we're really excited with being able to put this much information all together. We can prove a lot of the properties, but not all of them. And so one paper kind of sets up this construct and talks about the numerics and explains this diagram in detail. And then the other one kind of has more of like the proofs of what we can prove about this thing. So yeah, as I mentioned, the color codes correspond to different sign signatures and so on. So let me go ahead to my final slide. I don't want to, this is a picture of the fold. And it's super interesting to look at how it perturbs when we start moving away from the integrable case in Lotka-Volterra. See the movie of the folds. Not so clear even with the movie, but the manifold is actually blowing up in the beta 1 direction. Yeah, but anyway, big picture conclusion. So I've introduced to you the qualitative inverse problem, shown you various pictures associated with that. And hopefully that opens your mind to another way you can think about parameter fitting for models. And then there's the Bayesian approach, where again, I want to advocate for the Jacobian prior. All of this is pretty much in collaboration with my great colleague, David Swegan. Some of the earlier work was with these MDs over here, very talented as well, surprisingly quantitatively capable. Shelby, I mentioned, and Zhao Yu, who worked with us on all the nonlinear stuff and Lotka-Volterra stuff, now a postdoc in the research branch at NIH. So it was great working with all of these guys and guys and girls. So thanks a lot for your attention.
So in the example you showed about the linear system, where you could have so different behaviors with climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the problem with hopeless, but eventually you don't find this sensitivity.
Right. So you have to, if you look at a diagram like this, right? If your third data point, is right here, then you have extreme sensitivity. So that's the way to get an example like the one I showed you. Pick a case like that.
So back like the very beginning, we talked about like searching for parameters in a model, like searching for all set of all functional models. So like here for example, you're trying to find qualities of A, and you're assuming that the data was generated. You assuming the process by which data was generated. Here's if you've like tried to break that, like generate data from some other model, pretend it was generated through something else.
Right. So first of all, I'll say like right away, like if we observe time 0, time 1, time 2, we know this is the wrong model. So we've learned a lot. On the other hand, we might use a different model to generate, P0, P1, P2 right here. And we would learn that there's a Lotka-Volterra model that fits that data. So as far as that moment in time, we could not rule out this wrong conclusion that Lotka-Volterra is what produced this data. However, because that data was here, we would say, okay, if a Lotka-Volterra system produced this data, it's a predator-prey system.
Yeah.
And if you know that the underlying system that you're measuring from is not some sort of predator-prey system, then again, you know, okay, probably not Lotka-Volterra.
Yeah, but I guess, you know, thinking from the point of view of like, you're trying to learn something about the system, right? You're trying to learn whether it's predator or prey.
Yeah.
Like, you're trying to like,
So you've measured this data, and this data tells you if it's Lotka-Volterra, it's predator-prey.
right, but
In other words, if you
not-
know it's an ecological system with two
Yeah.
species interacting with, you know, relatively minor contributions from other species, Lotka-Volterra is a pretty decent starting point as a model. And this would tell you, okay, these species that I'm trying to learn about probably have a predator-prey relationship.
yeah,
That's also really valuable.
right, yeah, I guess you know, asking now is like, is it possible to define something like the set of all predator prey models, even if it's not in the Lotka-Volterra
Yeah,
formulation?
yeah. So interestingly, you know, you can have different nonlinearities, and you can introduce a perturbation. You can introduce some of these as a perturbation to the baseline Lotka-Volterra and start turning up the perturbation parameter more and more. Think of it as like a homotopy, from one model to another. And what will happen if you do that is this diagram, including the folds, will perturb nicely. So this is already useful. And then you start perturbing and watch how quickly the features change as you warp or morph from this model to the one you think is a better nonlinearity. So like some of this folding goes away really fast, and other parts of it stay. And when we've tried that experiment, and new folds can show up, but it's all continuous. As long as you warp your models continuously. It's useful.
So these colors means as long as you observe the first data point in one color, then you know the sign.
And
Yes. So to get these curves, is it wrong, like purely numerical, or you have some?
right, so some of it is direct numerics, some of it is we've thought of ways to use auto and follow these as bifurcation curves, and then some of the properties we could prove. So in some cases, we could prove the exact, you know, form for the line or the curve. In other cases, we could prove something partial. The way that we prove things in this setting is different things require different pieces, you know, approaches. So we made use of thinking about where the fixed point of the system could be. That turned out to be one useful idea. Another was the integral itself, especially for some of the timing arguments, because we know, you know, that energy is constant on trajectories. So both of those are useful, and then, yeah, playing around with approximating solutions to Lotka-Volterra. We just had to use different methods for different pieces.
Okay.
So sorry.
All right. All right. Thanks.